Hi there, Blender users. Here is a quick tip on how to use the array modifier. Alright, first of all, we're going to add arrays to any piece of mesh. Works with curves as well, I believe, but usually you'll do it with a piece of mesh. So for now, I'll do it with this cube here. So the modifier itself is under the modifiers panel. That is the blue wrench over in the properties window here. We're going to click on add modifier and choose array. Now, the default type of array that we're going to have access to here is what's called a relative offset. All this means is that we can have every copy in an array, or every iteration or instance, follow the same kind of protocol. In this case, this many units in the x-axis, or the y, or the z-axis. Now, this could be really useful if you're doing things like stair steps. I could set the count to as many as we want. I'll say 22. And then now when I zoom back here, I can see I've got 22 steps. If these blocks are all one by default in their size, I could essentially say one by one there. And now we've got stair steps that are going up for infinity, right? Quick note about this is that you can always go to edit mode for the mesh still. And if I were to move any part of that mesh for the original copy, check it out. Every subsequent piece follows suit, and it does the same thing, right? So this could be really useful if you wanted to say, hey, I actually want to make these look like stairs. You could just extrude out one of those faces, and boom. Now we have, yeah, it looks like a scene from Labyrinth or something. All right, good. So that's the default. Now, I don't mind the default setting for arrays, but I think if you want to get more creative here and create some abstract imagery, there's a much better technique, which is called the object offset. So if I were to, instead of using this relative offset, if I were to unclick that, now there's not any kind of model being used for this array. Instead, if in object mode I add a new object, add empty, and just choose plain axes. And empty is a non-rendering object. And that just means that if I were to do things like move it, scale it, or rotate it, Blender would remember those settings. But if I go to render it, we wouldn't actually see anything at that spot. So if I were to grab the mesh again and say, hey, I am now in the array modifier, this time I want to use object offset, I could go ahead and choose which object. I want to say, hey, I want to use the empty as the offset. Now it looks like just something weird happened here, but what really matters, I'm going to hit the Z key to go to wireframe mode. If I grab that empty and make sure it's the thing that's selected, what matters is the distance, the rotation, and the scale between the empty and the original object. So if I were to start rotating just a little bit on that empty, we can see that now if I've rotated this by 14.7 degrees between this and this, then the next copy will rotate by 14.7 degrees and 14.7 and more. So the effect will kind of accumulate across any of these objects. That's rotation. If I were to hit S to scale, then each new copy would get, in this case, 80% smaller than the last. Or G will let us move. So between rotating, scaling, and moving, we can kind of do a lot of fun stuff. What's great to know is that the count that is set to the modifier on your mesh, we can always bump that up if we want to. So here I've got 52 copies. And a really nice thing too is that when we go to rotate or scale or move, but specifically rotate and scale, if I go to hit R to rotate this now, it's going to rotate along one axis. I can always now hit the X to rotate just in the x-axis, or Y to do just in the y-axis, or Z. And by using these in combination, you can get some really great looks. Now that's what's called a one-dimensional array. That's one cube with 52 copies. That's all kind of adhering to the same relationship between that original empty, which is here, and the cube, the original cube. Now, to make things kind of cooler, guess what we can do? We can add a second empty to the scene. I'll say Shift-A, add empty. Now I've got two empties. This one's called empty.001. If I were to add a second array modifier to that original cube, I'll click up here in the modifiers panel, add array, array. Now look what I have. It's going to still have the same basic setups. The default setup is relative offset. Let's forget that and instead choose object offset. And I'm going to choose the new empty, empty.001. Okay, now I've got two copies. I'll go ahead and bump the copies up to say 8. Now, this is getting kind of interesting looking, very mechanical. But if I wanted to say grab empty.001, this is the second or newest empty that I made, I could just select it in the what's called the outliner window up at the top right. All right, now it is selected. If you recall, the relationship between the cube and the empty in question is what matters. So what if now that I have empty.001 selected, what if I hit R to rotate, G to move, S to scale, and I can still do things like rotate just in the x-axis to create something interesting. I could still hit G to kind of move them in closer or further away. So we have lots of good options here. So you can do what are called multi-dimensional arrays here. This is the first array creates one little finger of a pattern, and then the second array modifier is adding copies. So each finger kind of becomes digits on a hand, if you will. Gosh, you can keep on doing these as many times until your computer crashes if you want to. But there we go. We have the kind of creative use of an array here. Quick note is that once you start making big arrays like this, if they get really huge, when you go to render this, you might hit what's called a clipping distance. That means the objects are so big that they fall outside of what your camera can see. You can change the clipping distance of your camera in your camera settings, but another quick way is to hit the A key to select everything in your scene here, and just scale everything down. Just make it smaller. Now that we've scaled it down, the clipping distance, this is much more likely to fit within the clipping distance and will be in better shape to go ahead and render something like this. So there you go. Have fun. Hopefully you can create some great abstract and beautiful looking imagery. Bye-bye.